You're listening to Contesting Wrestling, the podcast where we talk about what fans love and what other people might not about the world's most popular form of simulated combat. My name is Evan Burke. I am a writer. I am somebody who has known the other two guys on this podcast for decades, and yet I have never, ever been able to enjoy wrestling in any meaningful capacity. All of the individual parts of it are cool. Many of the individual parts of it are cool, but I've never really been able to get why you would watch wrestling and not do almost anything else with your time.
And my name is Doc Diamondfire. I have been in the pro wrestling business. I first started over 10 years ago now. I've trained with Johnny Rods. I've trained with Chikara Pro. You can see me around doing mostly announcing and commentator work, but I can certainly wrestle a match if given the task. I've known Evan for a very long time, and I'm going to tell him what I know about wrestling. And I look forward to seeing a fresh perspective, as I find so many of the perspectives that we see are from minds that have watched and consumed wrestling for decades and decades, and honestly, it's a little stale to me. On that note, I'd like to introduce the third part of this podcast. Take it away, Professor.
I am Dr. Ben Abelson. I am a professor of philosophy at Mercy College and also a mind that has consumed decades of wrestling. And I will attempt to provide a somewhat scholarly perspective on professional wrestling to emphasize the things about it that I find to be particularly valuable and interesting for Evans and perhaps the general edification of our audience.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Both of you are doctors, yet I only respect one of your doctorates. And you know what? It's not who you're expecting.
I'll just say good man, Evan. So let's get into this. People talk about how Abraham Lincoln was a wrestler, and a lot of people don't know a lot of the story about that. People ask, oh, was it amateur or pro? And I'm like, it was the 1820s and the 1830s. That line did not exist.
What was wrestling like back then?
We don't really know exactly.
We have a pretty good idea. It was usually, the object was simply to throw your opponent to the ground so their back touched the ground. And that was it. And records aren't as good as they are now. Historians have said that they have found one recorded loss for Lincoln. The thing that people don't really realize is he was also an accomplished trash talker. He'd stand there and insult the people into fighting him and then beat them and then insult them because he beat them. And then once his body started breaking down, he became the president.
When I say that we don't really know what was going on, we don't know to what degree these things were worked or shoots.
That's true.
Right. Do you think that in ancient Greece they were combining wrestling and theater, since that is basically where our modern concepts of those two things originated?
Yeah, from what I understand, not so much. I think Greek wrestling was fairly legitimately a sport.
Well, they were really into sports, and keep in mind their theater was just murdering people.
No, they had theater. You're thinking of the Romans.
They had theater.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of that.
No, they had all sorts of theater.
So
they had all sorts of
which
theater.
Actually, I think, in some ways, is the closest thing to our professional wrestling of any other art form in history.
With the character archetypes and so on.
With the character archetypes, with the chorus representing the audience and things like that.
Agreed.
They just wouldn't really have seen the point in sports entertainment, right? Because it's either you've got sports, and the whole point of sports is to objectively see who's the best at the thing or not, and then you got entertainment where the whole point of it is to tell a pre-constructed story that isn't necessarily based on who's technically the best at anything or not. And so combining those two things might have seemed weird.
On the other hand, their theater presentations were all also competitions.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, you
Tell us
won
about
the
that,
award
Professor.
for like the best tragedy or the best comedy or whatever.
Oh, man.
Really? They had the ancient Greek Emmys.
I mean,
we
but
do that today, don't we?
yeah, each festival specifically was cast as a competition.
I guess when I look at it, and when I look at wrestling, question I have about it is, what is the point? It seems to defeat both the purpose of sports and of written entertainment.
I think the idea is sports often has very dramatic moments.
Sure.
And there's a certain kind of pattern maybe to what makes for good sports moments. But you can't plan them in advance, right? They just happen when they happen. And so most of sports, and I think you would sympathize with this to some degree, most of sports is really boring. Most of sports is not exciting. Most of sports does not speak to you emotionally, things like that. So I think part of the idea behind pro wrestling is to take the drama of sports and to create an art form that always gives you that.
The thrill of victory and the agony of defeat.
So
The wide world of sports.
Make it so that every time you tune in to the game, you're seeing a game that goes to a, bases loaded, bottom of the nine, full on, like what is going to happen, truly edge of your seat kind of thing. That's the idea.
Maybe not every time do that, but find out how often an audience actually wants that. Because if every baseball game went into extra innings because the players were so sharp, it wouldn't be exciting.
Right.
And if every wrestling match was a super nail biter, the two best athletes in the world fighting for the richest prize in the world, that wouldn't mean anything after a little while.
But doesn't that kind of leave the door open for so that's why a lot of wrestling has to suck to make the other wrestling meaningful.
Yes.
Yeah, very much so. Same thing with actual sports. A lot of baseball games, again, for example, scores 2-1 after 3 hours. Yawn.
Right, but that's the whack part of sports, though, right? Like, if you're going to have a completely constructed, fictitious sport, why keep the shitty parts?
That's... if you're going to make a delicious dessert, why not just have a pile of sugar? Because that's the part that makes it sweet, right?
I don't know.
Well, no, it's that's the thing with entertainment.
Evan is partial to a pile of sugar.
I meant more, look, why? I mean, yeah, cut out the middleman. Just put the sugar in your face until you have diabetes.
I get the point.
I was more skeptical as to that analogy.
You might think of it this way, where yes, you have to have peaks and valleys. What wrestling does is it idealizes both the peaks and the valleys to make the peaks that much more effective.
Okay.
Right. So it's a way of figuring out the best possible reward pattern and then engineering that.
Also, to keep in mind that a lot of people, including children who know what wrestling is and what the level of, reality is, still see it as a sports analog. And instead of watching it for an exciting match or a good performance, they want to see their favorite wrestlers win. So they root for them. And they don't care if the match is very exciting or not. They just want their guy to win.
This is either going to be the first episode or one of the first episodes.
It's a good discussion to start the podcast off.
This isn't two guys who love wrestling and one guy who hates wrestling yelling their points at each other. This is me trying to understand why people like wrestling, what the draw is beyond the, basic visceral thrill you can get from it, I guess. When I first suggested we should pick a match for our first episode, you guys were in pretty quick agreement that this is arguably the start of modern wrestling.
So the match we're talking about today, or the good match that we're talking about today, is Bret the Hitman Hart versus Stone Cold Steve Austin from Wrestlemania 13, which was in March of 1997. I think that the specific value and importance of this match comes from the fact that it is a stylistic departure for the World Wrestling Federation at the time, now World Wrestling Entertainment. People generally break up WWF/E history into eras, and this was the shift from one era to another, and I'd say perhaps the most significant shift in the history of wrestling.
Now, I will say my knowledge of wrestling comes from, I was born in 1984, which meant I was, in the exact right age range for what I know is called the Attitude Era, right? Which is like the late 90s, the new metal era, basically, right?
Right.
And I heavily associate
The extreme era, starting with an X.
Yes.
Not several X's. That wouldn't start until the early 2000s.
Korn coming right at you with a Mountain Dew, like fucking full 90s. And I very heavily associate wrestling with a lot of the nightmarish masculinity of the late 90s, early 2000s, of just like, of drowning pool, the word metrosexual. I think of that era and just like, I think wrestling's dumb, guys. When I think of wrestling, I think of that point in time, and when I see it now, it doesn't seem like it's that different, and I'll admit I've never really gotten into it, but that's because it seems like it is this giant firewall of just dumb shit.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to say to that. To begin with, I mean, that attitude era of wrestling, I don't know if you remember when we were hanging out, like freshman, sophomore year of high school, I wasn't really that into wrestling.
Yeah, I guess it was only when in our late teens, early 20s, when Doc came into the mix, did you start getting really hardcore back into it.
Those years of like the height of the Attitude Era, particularly like 98, 99, was actually the only time in my life where I wasn't really that big of a wrestling fan. I wasn't into it because for me, it wasn't that much about wrestling. The Attitude Era was all about these like sophomore humor, dick jokes, suck it, ass cream, things like that.
Just in case this winds up being the first episode, I've relayed the story a few times, but I have a very specific memory from probably about 16 years ago, us sitting in your room. You guys were watching wrestling, and there was an extended bit about ass cream, where somebody had a giant jar of cream and it said ass cream on the side.
Yeah,
and this
Christian's ass cream.
It went on for so long, and that's all the joke. It was just people saying the words ass cream to each other. And in that moment, I was like, this is now a thing that Ben and Doc are into and will be a separate part of our friendship forevermore.
The things that, I genuinely love and value about wrestling were not very present during that period. They were more so before and after. During that period, I still enjoyed watching it occasionally, but more in a kind of like elitist, laughing at the idiots who like this stupid shit. And then
that
more
scene
and more
grew big starting around then.
Yeah. And then more and more, perhaps it is just that I have become one of those idiots. More and more over the years, I've been sucked into it. But I also think that, and this is a point I think I'll make a lot in this podcast, that the makeup of the audience to a large degree determines the character of the wrestling product. And so I'd like to think that as more people like me have become bigger fans of wrestling, the product has come to take on a shape that embodies the things that I and people like me find valuable.
Well, if I can, not to get too far from our initial point, but if I could bring things to the present. Right now, as we're recording this, the debate within just the wrestling community in general, not even the fan community, but as wrestlers, is how exactly are we defining this going forward? The phrase performance art has been said a lot, and it's nothing new that wrestling has been described as performance art, but we're finally to the point where a large chunk of the people who have become wrestlers over the last 5 to 10 years will immediately say, yeah, this is performance art. I'm going out there and playing a character who's not myself, having a predetermined match where we all act like it's real and the audience comes to see that performance. Isn't that cool? But the older people in the wrestling community, some of them are cool, some of them get it, but some of them don't. Some of them are like, well, you've killed the business by openly telling everybody that it's fake, openly telling everybody that you have real names, and, exposing the business, as the phrase goes. And it's becoming a big cultural war in the middle of it. So it's changing rapidly and sharply right now, and I find it fascinating.
One of the most interesting things about wrestling to me as well is how these things change.
Yeah.
And so to bring it back to our match that we're talking about today, for me, as opposed to the vast majority of people who watched this match who were impressed by it at the time, the stylistic shift from Bret Hart to Steve Austin, for me, it was a negative thing. For me, it actually took me out of wrestling because I liked the older style. And we'll talk a bit about what those styles really embody.
That was one of the big differences, I think, between you and me. And I didn't know you yet at the time. Whereas you saw the change and thought, well, I want wrestling the way it was. I saw the change, and it affected me, going through being a teenager, is that wrestling grew up with me, including its really dumb phase, which I look back on with affection, but would not at all want them to do now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you are slightly older than me.
Yes.
So, you were already full on adolescent, I think, when
yes.
Austin was hitting, whereas I was still younger. So I didn't quite get it the same way that other people did.
Right. That makes sense. Those couple of years make a big difference.
This is pretty much the first time in my life I've sat down and chosen to watch wrestling in my own home. The first time in, probably 10 years I've actually really even seen any at all. And there have been some changes since I was younger. I used to be pretty much just an completely anti all forms of sports and athleticism because I came of age during the waning days of the jock-nerd dichotomy. Only as I have entered early middle age and stared into the face of mortality have I begun to exercise myself, and then that has led to me starting to be able to appreciate athleticism to some degree. If not, I'm still not into sports. I've been in and out of the theater in my life. My mom was in the theater. I've done acting. I've done comedy. There's a lot going on right away in this match, and I imagine in wrestling in general, that I can appreciate that I couldn't before. I can see the training that's involved here. I can see the communication that's happening. The way that two actors in a scene will hate each other, but underneath that, they're really communicating with each other. I see a lot of that going on. So there is something I can appreciate right off the bat.
So, yeah, let me give you maybe some of the historical context, which I think is sort of overlooked in how much wrestling matches are informed by history.
Sure.
And how much the meaning and what's presented, the story of the match, depends on these sorts of extrinsic kind of features. The history of the WWF/E is usually broken up into eras, beginning with, I guess, the Hogan era, or the golden age of the WWF, which was in the 80s. Evan, you and I were both born in the year that Hulkamania was born.
Oh, yeah.
1984. Hulkamania being the sort of pseudo-religious devotion to the wrestler Hulk Hogan.
The ultimate realization of George Orwell's nightmare, yes.
Pseudo.
Okay, well, yeah, he did actually tell his followers to say their prayers,
yes,
among other commandments.
Well, like many cults, it just escalated at first. Like Hulk's 3 commandments: you say your prayers, you take your vitamins, and you train. And then later he added, believe in yourself. And then later he added, and believe in Hulk Hogan.
Right. Those were in the days when he was afraid people were going to forget about him.
This was after the steroid trial and, in the mid-90s. Okay.
So speaking of that...
Around now, actually, just before what we're about to talk about.
Right. So exactly. That brings us to the end of that era. So Vince McMahon, who's the owner of the WWF, his big cash cow, Hulk Hogan, is starting to wane in popularity a little bit. He wants to do movies. He doesn't want to beat his body up so much anymore. And it's just, the money train was leaving the station at that point. And Vince had to figure out something else. Also, he was dealing with this steroid trial that Doc mentioned.
And the IRS auditing the entirety of the WWF for about a year. They found nothing. Just saying, of all the problems that they had, the IRS went all the way through the WWF and were like, oh, you paid us. And Vince is like, yes, I paid you. Leave us alone.
So outside of steroids being bad for you,
Yeah.
like on a health level, why is it bad to do steroids in wrestling?
Well, the health part is the most of it. In the early 90s, it was because they had just made steroids illegal.
Okay.
And we're not going to... This is a thing that has actually been covered to death in other wrestling media. I'll give you the very short version of the steroid trial, which was...
You understand my confusion, right?
Yes,
like
yes,
like
of
in
course.
sports, it makes sense because you're trying to make sure who
Yeah.
naturally got there. But in wrestling, isn't it just about who can put on the best show?
It's completely a health thing, but, well, okay. Yes, it's about who can put on the best show, but putting on the best show might involve having the best body. It might have having the most stamina, having the most stamina in a match or something like that, right? So you can perform way better if you're on steroids. Now, the fact that
Thank you,
steroids...
Professor Abelson. You can perform much better if you're
Well,
on
yeah.
steroids.
Well, yeah, 'cause it's
for
also-
some limited period
Right, for
of
a
time
little while.
'Cause also it's-
until your body breaks down and your balls shrivel up and whatever else.
Which is like,
then you
don't
have a
get me
heart
wrong.
attack in time.
You have, or you fucking lose your mind and murder your family.
Which
But
all-
that was probably more about concussions. But
Well, yeah, and all of that is obviously, like, steroids are bad. You shouldn't be doing them,
Right.
but it's just funny to work for a guy who's like, look, I don't want you taking any performance-enhancing drugs. Now get out there and leap fucking 12 feet onto the Spanish announcer's table and break it. Like,
Vince specifically was always into bodybuilders. Bodybuilding missed our generation because bodybuilders started to look like awful veiny freaks right around the time we started becoming aware of the world. But bodybuilding was a major sport for young boys to look up to bodybuilders for decades and decades, up until like just after Arnold Schwarzenegger. Like the Arnold Schwarzenegger bodybuilding pictures are very tasteful. He looks great, and everyone that comes after him looks awful, in my opinion. My point about the bodybuilding thing is Vince would then give the better jobs and the more money to the people that looked the biggest, which encouraged everyone to take as many steroids as possible, and that destroys their body and they die.
so Vince unwittingly creates a problem. Okay, I see. Yeah,
And
yeah.
also keep in mind, just not to completely throw Vince under the bus, which I'll do if it's warranted, they didn't really know what steroids would do to you until like the early 80s, and they weren't even illegal until 1990.
Oh, wow.
So
Didn't know
yeah, when they first came out in bodybuilding circles in the 60s, you could go to the doctor, he'd give you 100 syringes and as much steroids as you wanted, because why wouldn't he?
Yeah.
And then they found out, oh no, this is really bad for you, and they took him off the market.
I feel like if you threw Vince McMahon under a bus, everyone on that bus would die, and Vince would still be at work the next day.
Accurate.
But I think another point you were making there, Evan, is to say, look, wrestling is bad for you anyway.
Yes.
Right? Like, okay, so it's a little bit worse for you if you take steroids, right? You're already choosing a path of life that is going to destroy you. But it doesn't have to be that bad for you, I think. But I defer actually to Doc on this. Should we in any way attempt to mitigate how bad wrestling is for the participants? Or is it just a matter of kind of, well, you're a wrestler, so...
Well, we absolutely should try to mitigate it. I mean, there is a point. We do know that, what we're doing is not good for our bodies. That being said, I'm a big fan of the fact that several years ago, the WWE started banning chair shots to the head, because you don't need to hit each other in the head with big pieces of steel all the time in order to put on a good show. And since they're the leader in the industry, trickled down, and now it's very rare anywhere to see that. There are still places that will do it, but it had become way too standard. So yeah, I think we should be mitigating that. But I think the better way to mitigate it that we don't do it is to maybe give the wrestlers like health insurance and time off.
There's a greater question of,
Yes.
does freedom mean giving somebody the freedom to do dumb shit that hurts themselves if it's their prerogative to do it? Which, you could say, oh, yeah, sure, no problem. But then on the other hand, then look at what happened. If you have a whole society filled with people doing that, then everybody's fucked and, we all start dying
early. It's a matter
early.
of degree,
Exactly.
not absolutes.
Right. I mean, steroids aside, there's a difference between you get old and your knees hurt, and you get old and your brain is freaking mush from concussions, so that you murder yourself and your family.
That's probably the worst thing that's ever happened in wrestling.
I guess as individual things
Right.
go, can you weigh the Benoit tragedy against the general exploitation of the industry as a whole? That's a whole thing. But speaking of exploitation...
And then there was also... The bad match we're going to talk about today is a nice example of that, but we're not there yet.
No, we are not. We're not there yet. We're not.
No.
Yeah, the bad match
So-
is... Yeah.
Okay, so the waning years
right
of the
on.
Hogan era, Vince McMahon decides that the WWF needs a squeaky clean image in order to survive the steroid trial and all this stuff.
They're competing with Disney.
Competing with Disney. So they transform into... They were already somewhat a kids show, but they double down on the kids thing. Everyone is a cartoon character. Everyone has another job for some reason besides being a wrestler. All with the exception of the top guy, who's Bret Hart. And Bret Hart isn't a cartoon character. His character is just that he is the best wrestler.
He is a professional murderer.
Well,
The
yes.
Hitman, yes.
Yes, right. That is what that word means.
Right. That is perhaps a little misleading. He got the Hitman moniker, I believe, from Gorilla Monsoon, who started by calling him the excellence of execution. He was actually a heel at the time. Heel meaning bad guy or villain in the wrestling parlance, as opposed to a face, or baby face. We'll talk about all of that. So he was a heel at the time, but the excellence of execution description applied to his execution of the wrestling moves.
So he's executing holds like a hitman would execute presidents for large amounts of money.
Right.
Something like
competently.
Yes.
Competently.
Excellently. So Bret's character, so in real life, he was a second generation wrestler, son of the Stu Hart, who is a wrestler and promoter in Canada, who eventually sold his business to Vince McMahon when Vince conquered the wrestling world in the early 80s. Bret is the one of 12 brothers and sisters.
Ugh.
8 brothers, 4 sisters. The 8 brothers were all wrestlers. The 4 sisters all married wrestlers. Bret grows up in this wrestling family and sort of represents the tradition of wrestling, of knowing what you're doing in the ring, executing the moves excellently, having a lot of respect for professional wrestling, having a lot of respect for your opponent. So he works for the kids because he represents these sort of traditional virtues of honesty and respect and discipline and hard work.
If you want to raise a good wrestler as a father, you should make sure that your love for your son is entirely contingent on whether or not they are good at wrestling. That's how you get a real masterpiece, you know?
Well, that's pretty much Stu Hart. Many of his boys were very successful as wrestlers, 2 of them making it huge on the worldwide stage, and several of the others being big stars in the Calgary area, which doesn't sound that impressive until you realize that wrestling used to be all regional, and they owned that place.
Yeah, and we'll get into this a bunch, but it certainly had not entirely positive effects on the psychology of some of his kids. Bret in particular will have reason to talk about, seemed to believe in pro wrestling a little bit too literally.
Too much, yeah.
So then this is kind of there's sort of a generational aspect to this match in the sense that, you know, you've got Bret Hart, the boomer ideal guy who worked hard his whole life and ascended to the top through a combination of hard work and skill and luck and, you know, just ballsiness and grabbing it. And then comes
nepotism.
Nepotism, good old,
nepotism.
Yeah, exactly. A story about hard work.
He did work incredibly hard. He had to compete with his other 7 brothers to make it to the top of his father's wrestling promotion. And then he made it everywhere else. He was very good. I love Bret, don't get me wrong, but you know.
Yeah, look, Nicolas Cage worked hard to become the greatest actor who's ever lived, and he's still a Coppola, you know. That has a huge part of how we got there.
Yeah, it's good to get your foot in the door.
Yeah, it's an uncontroversial statement I just made. But I think that, but anyway, so here's Bret Hart.
That explains it now.
And did you not know? Yeah, his name's Nicholas. He's Francis Ford Coppola's nephew, I think. So then, upstart Generation X nihilist Stone Cold Steve Austin, a wizard who can summon beer from nothing.
Oh, yes.
Who, you know, I get the impression from Stone Cold Steve Austin that he does not care for the rules.
No.
That he is perhaps too extreme for the rules.
Yeah, so at the point...
well observed, Evan, well observed.
So at this point, you know, the WWF audience was getting rather restless with the kiddie stuff, and that restlessness was causing them to go to other alternative sources of wrestling that were a little bit more adult in their presentation. WCW, which was owned by Ted Turner, World Championship Wrestling, they were always WWF's main competitor. But now, with their new Monday Nitro program, their edgy New World Order storyline and all this stuff, which also involved Hogan and all these other past stars of the WWF who had jumped ship. WCW was starting to beat WWF in the ratings, and it was looking like WWF might not survive. So there had to be this kind of shift to the extreme.
Yeah, this was before the WWF was a public company. I mean, they were a large company, but if they went down, it was just, McMahon's money, and they couldn't just draw a bunch more money. I'd like to point out something that a lot of wrestling, a lot of general wrestling media doesn't, and that it was indicative of a grander cultural shift across media, and it was happening very fast in the 90s. Back in 1990, like in late 1994, the biggest band in the world was Hootie and the Blowfish. In 1997, that wasn't valid at all anymore. Well, nobody had told the WWF that. WCW figured that out in 1996 and started moving grittier and more realistic and so on, and more extreme, as you would say. There was ECW, right. Which started properly in 1993, right in the thick of all of that, as just a small regional promotion that grew into prominence by having its finger on the pulse of the dirty wave of grunge and metal that was coming forward. By 1997, the WWF had largely missed that boat, partially out of necessity, as Professor Abelson was describing, but they were ready to go for it. Wrestling is always biggest when they reflect the culture at large currently. Usually, the WWE is a few years behind the time, but over the next few years, they would synergize with it perfectly and hit their biggest heights. And Stone Cold Steve Austin would lead the charge, and eventually hand it off to The Rock.
There's a funny parallelism here that we've already remarked on between our own ages and our own development and maturity and the development and maturity of the WWF.
Yeah.
Paralleling that more or less closely depending on our slight differences in age. And it's an interesting thing for me specifically because Bret Hart in 1996 loses the WWF title to Shawn Michaels. It's a kind of passing of the torch. And then he disappears. And he is gone from WWF for the entire summer and most of the fall, which is the time in which Steve Austin is coming to prominence. There's this famous Austin 316 promo from the King of the Ring 1996. I'm sure, Evan, you remember the Austin 316 t-shirts?
Yes. Yeah, I
very
feel like
popular.
I saw one last week.
Oh, you still see them. Well, Austin is still a big star, and that was a popular, thing. And
It was the most popular wrestling t-shirt of all time.
I will
think.
say
it
even
was simple enough to put on a shirt, too. It wasn't a picture of some guy's face.
Even with my distaste for wrestling, Stone Cold Steve Austin was a guy who I had sort of vaguely positive associations with until I Googled his name and the word allegations.
Yeah, I mean, that'll happen.
Yeah, I would imagine that happens in wrestling with at least the same frequency it happens in the music biz.
Yeah,
or anything,
about the same as, as just about everyone.
Yeah, as everyone in society.
It's
terrible.
So that King of the Ring promo was really the genesis of this whole thing. It's worth dwelling on for a moment. So Austin had just defeated Jake the Snake Roberts, who was also a star of the Hogan era, who was over the hill at this point and also was battling drug and alcohol addiction. And his whole character was that he had recovered and was now a born-again Christian.
Instead of his old snake, Damien, his new snake was called Revelations. It was a beautiful white and yellow python. Just fantastic. And also nobody believed him because he fell off the wagon immediately.
So the story of Jake the Snake Roberts is really good for an entire other episode, at least. Where Austin 316 comes from is Austin says, oh, you, Jake the Snake Roberts, you've got your John 3:16, you've got your Bible verses, this and that. Well, Austin 3:16 says, I just whooped your ass. That nice little cocktail of mild profanity and irreverence was just a fireball for the WWF audience.
And trying to criticize the born-again Christian is one thing. Austin, the dirty fighter, criticizing the born-again Christian that everybody knows is full of it anyway, is another fold in that I think is very important to point out, because people knew that Jake wasn't sticking to that.
Okay,
I think a really popular thing in culture at that time was uncovering hypocrisy.
Yes.
Right? It's like you could be as bad as you wanted as long as you were honest about it. That made you good.
And you've said before that that's basically what makes, or at least for many years, that's what made a villain or a hero in wrestling, is whether it is either adherence to a particular set of values or a hypocritical expression.
But everyone was fine with Hogan being a hypocrite. I mean, Bobby the Brain Heenan would call Hogan out all the time on his hypocrisy.
Yeah.
But everyone was cool with it because they loved Hogan.
And the bad guys were such cartoon character villains,
Okay, this might be a bit broad of a question, but at this point in time, who is wrestling for? Is it just for adolescent boys? Does this represent a transformation in who it is
at
for?
that moment, wrestling was very much for young men, and all of those young men were watching WCW. I think that's the short answer. WWF didn't know who they were going for.
Wrestling is always meant for everyone, and that's, I think, what's kind of cool about it. That's what makes it very lowest common denominator a lot of the times. But that also, you can also cast that as it being universal, as it having, a kind of human appeal.
Well, or at least it's the people who are making it want it to be for everybody.
Right. They want as big an audience as possible.
Right, because I would say that maybe there's a lowest common denominator aspect, but there is extremely heavy coding going on in wrestling, right? Like there's extremely heavy, like, for dudes coding so even if the people making it want to appeal to as many people as possible, I do feel like it still feels like it has a very narrow.
That's not a thing that's been true forever, though. The coding has kind of been similar for the last 100 years, but audiences have responded to it differently. Like for example, in many of the southern circuits in the 70s and the 80s, the audiences were like 60-40 women. The women were coming to see the oiled up shirtless men. And then they would follow them around the road just like they were rock stars. And the men wouldn't want to go sometimes because Dave Meltzer, the world's most famous wrestling journalist, caught on way before anyone else that women's wrestling was getting incredibly good in Japan in the very early 90s. So he would go to Japan to see the women's wrestling shows. He'd be the only man there because their demographic were teenage girls and they were pop idols. And for example,
I will say, like, it's an easy joke and an easy observation to make about, like, the homoeroticism of wrestling, intentional or probably mostly unintentional. And how much does the audience pick up on or not? But, like, it is. Watching this match, it being the first match I've watched in God knows how long, it is supremely intimate.
Oh,
like,
yes.
It is an unbelievably. It is not just like the physical contact, not just the communication, like the trust that has to go into it. Mm-hmm. Like it, maybe it's sexual, maybe it's not sexual. It's easy to say that it is, certainly, but it is unquestionably a remarkably intimate act, and I would say a lot more intimate than two actors. Even more, I went to college for music. I was a musician for most of my life. Playing music with somebody else is a very intimate act. It's got fucking nothing on wrestling.
There's a bunch of critical theory actually talking about. There was one volume published by, I think, MIT Press. It's called Steel Chair to the Head, that had some articles in it talking about representations of masculinity in wrestling, but also wrestling as a sort of way for men to kind of have a safe space in which to work out their intimacy with each other. So for instance, in tag team wrestling, the idea that you have a partner who's going to save you or who might betray you or things like that is playing with, a lot of our maybe insecurities about men's relationships with other men, that, they don't really have another outlet for meditating on.
And I think there's been ink spilled in at least one YouTube documentary about, like, the intimacy of MMA and how that can serve, especially amongst guys who are still very into traditional ideas of masculinity, but also are human beings who need to express themselves and need to express, intimate feelings. It basically creates a safe space for them to touch each other, a safe space for them to get close to another human being and share a really intense experience with each other.
The pure physical aspect of it, then, which is the other side of it, you talk about the kind of what it is in the abstract, but like as opposed to actors on stage where they'll spend an hour dancing around each other and then they'll kiss or something, or even musicians on stage. Fleetwood Mac will play for 2 hours, and at the peak of one of their biggest hits, Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham will kiss, and the audience will be like, "Oh, they're getting back together." It's like, no, they still hate each other. They do it every night, and that's why they can charge $1,000 for tickets.
Does that really happen at Fleetwood Mac shows?
Not anymore, because currently Lindsey Buckingham isn't in the band, but that was their big main event for a long time. Wow. They'd sing together, they'd have their thing, and then finally they'd come together, and the audience would come back every time. Brilliant, by the way.
You heard about Rammstein Rammstein recently?
Yes.
Oh,
I
yes.
did.
Yeah, that was
Good for them,
good.
man.
Go Rammstein.
Oh,
That's in
Rammstein.
Russia?
In Russia, yes.
Yeah.
They did a homosexual kiss on stage in Russia for anyone that doesn't
Where
know.
it's illegal.
Yeah.
Very illegal, and the guys in Rammstein don't particularly like that. Anyway, yeah, so when you're in the ring with somebody, and like when you train, one of the first things you have to get over is the intense physical contact with somebody else. That's not just like, it's not just violent, it's cooperative. If I'm going to body slam somebody, I have to, like the physical things, throw their arm over my shoulder. I'll put my arm over their shoulder. I'll put my other arm all the way between their legs, and the crook of my elbow is at their crotch. Fully. And if it's not, I'm being unsafe. If you hook the person halfway up their thigh or on their knee and lift, they can't get a base on your arm to push themselves up to go around. And what could happen is I can either injure their knee or flip them over onto their head. No, I need to get like my arm as tightly as possible around the other person's crotch.
It's like you really are trying to find the single most gentle way to do violence on somebody else.
Exactly.
That's like,
Very much so.
Yeah, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Doc, that as a professional wrestler, most of the time at least, you want to maximize the appearance of damage and violence while minimizing its reality.
Yeah. Mick Foley said in his book, Have a Nice Day, that people would send him VHS tapes of themselves bloodying themselves horrible, doing like the cheese grater spot. And he said, next time you do the cheese grater spot, do what the pros do. One guy holds a cheese grater a millimeter away from your face, and the other guy makes a face.
do you
And
find...
this was Mick Foley, who bled buckets and destroyed his body. He's no stranger to just abusing himself for it, but still, you don't just scrape a cheese grater across your face. That's stupid.
So in the locker room at a wrestling training facility,
Yeah.
is it a space where it is more okay? Because like men are bad, at least straight guys. We are not good at like being able to compliment each other. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? The way that like literally every other group of people is able to be like, "Hey, you look hot today," and it's not an issue. And is that like since fashioning your body into an ideal is at least kind of part of what you're all doing there? Is it more acceptable to be like, bro, looking sexy?
Well, I mean, you don't necessarily say looking sexy, but you go up to somebody and say, hey, man, your abs are coming in. That's great. What are you doing? And then the other person will be like, well, these are my workouts, or I'm doing this diet. And, you'll directly compare body parts. And it's in a lot of other places, like straight men or not, it's considered very rude to just comment on other people's bodies.
Well, yeah.
It's not really in a wrestling locker room or in many places of performance like that where everybody's looking at your body anyway. It's just par for the course.
Sure, and it's kind of why you're all, or at least part of why you're all there, or it's it's a part of everybody's journey.
To shy away from it would be doing all of us a disservice. Just for the sake of all of our egos. We feed our own egos plenty. We don't need somebody to also tell us that we look great unless we look great.
So, getting back to the match.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, getting back to Bret Hart versus Steve Austin.
I want to
Might
learn
as
more
well pull
about
it back
gym
to it.
etiquette because I'm going to join a gym for the first time, and I need to know how to be in there.
I can talk to you about that later.
That's
if you
okay.
want.
That'll be our other podcast.
So while this whole King of the Ring thing is happening, Bret Hart's not around. I wasn't around. I was in summer camp that summer. I was not watching wrestling. I missed the whole Austin 316 thing. I come back at the end of the summer and everybody loves Austin. Bret's still not back yet. And I kind of don't get it. I'm like, this guy whoops your ass, this and that. Like, I don't, he's okay. I guess he's kind of a good wrestler, but come on. Bret is the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. And I really believed that and still kind of do. So this shift was happening and I wasn't quite on board with it myself. I was at the Survivor Series in 1996 where Bret Hart returns and wrestles Austin for the first time, and they have a great little wrestling match. Bret wins. The crowd is not entirely pleased about that. Like, about half the crowd is cheering. The other half of the crowd is like, we kind of wanted Austin to win. I didn't understand that, but that was what was happening.
Well, just like me, Bret was your guy. But if you hadn't seen the direct rise of Austin on the TV for the previous couple of months, like, it was confusing for a Bret guy because Austin was clearly, like, he had some worth that was very different from the Hitman's.
It was confusing to a Bret guy, and it was confusing to the guy, Bret.
Right.
The character didn't understand what was happening. Why is he losing his fans? Why aren't people respecting him the same way? Why aren't people respecting him for beating Austin? Austin lost. He showed he was the better man. Why are they cheering for Austin? This kind of thing has happened.
It seems like Bret is better at the technical side of wrestling. Bret is a better athlete, per se. And Austin, while not necessarily a bad one, is perhaps better at the performance aspect. He is better at inhabiting a character, better at the entertainment part of sports entertainment.
For sure.
And
Austin was a very good technical wrestler, but he was no Bret Hart. Bret learned very well over the years to work his character, which was kind of a subtle character, but Austin's character, which he worked very well, was fresh, new, and in tune with the current culture.
Now, is that part of the frustration that happened, where people previously were more into the idea of this is an athletic contest, at least the appearance of it being an athletic contest is important, whereas moving over to Austin was like, well, now we're just admitting that this is a show.
I think that's definitely the case to some degree. So for a lot of wrestling fans, every generation of wrestling fans, there's a wrestler who they think isn't getting their due. And it's usually someone who's really good at the technical, athletic parts of wrestling, but is not particularly charismatic, or their charisma is sort of weird and people don't get it. And yeah, so there's always like the smart fans' favorites. So there's that kind of like snobbery, I think, that tends to veer towards the no frills, the less entertainment-y, more sportsy, pure wrestler kind of thing. And you had that in the 80s.
In the 80s, the debate, because wrestling was still largely regional, was, are you a fan of Hulk Hogan, who punched
Hogan or Flair,
and kicked and gouged eyes and did great promos and shook, or Ric Flair, who would wrestle for an hour straight without taking a step back or a hard breath?
And then the 90s, it was really Bret. The 90s, when Bret was the champion, was kind of the only time that character really got to be the champion.
Is because business was in the toilet, and the only people watching were the people who were going to watch wrestling no matter what was happening.
Like me.
Yeah. It was him and Shawn Michaels, who was an incredible athlete and very charismatic in his own right, but some people didn't like him because he wasn't very big, and other people didn't like him because he's, as Vince McMahon would say repeatedly on commentary, flamboyant. So you can fit that in.
Yeah.
The crowd at the Manhattan Center would have a few other words to use to describe Shawn Michaels.
It has only become the case recently that wrestlers coded as gay or like flamboyant or whatever are beloved by fans more often than hated. It used to be like, you want to get heat, you want to get the crowd to go against you, act gay.
I feel like
that's no longer the case, but only very recently.
I feel like that was society's setting until like 2012, maybe something like that.
Well, like I said, it's the reflection of society, and when it does it correctly, it's when people start to like wrestling.
Now, you guys referred to this match as the Hart-Austin double turn. Yes. What is that? What does that mean?
As we talked about the crowd reacting in kind of an ambiguous fashion to their previous match. But in this match, as far as the story is concerned, Bret Hart is still firmly the babyface, the good guy, and Stone Cold Steve Austin is still firmly the heel, the bad guy, even though both of them are getting very mixed reactions. It's been bubbling for a long time, and during this match, they executed perfectly something that's very difficult to do, in that by the end of the match, Austin was clearly the good guy, and Bret was clearly the bad guy. That's hard to do in any form of media. If you ever see them do it in a movie, it's after building up a good guy for 2 hours, and then he's the bad guy, and the villain was the good guy. It's very difficult to pull off.
Yeah, they did it very skillfully. From the beginning, just from their entrances, you get Austin has this glass shattering thing, and he walks out, and then Bret has to kind of walk over the broken glass,
right?
Representing the years of wrestling tradition that Austin has shattered.
And the trial that's in front of him now.
And Bret, at the beginning, he's still playing the babyface. He gives his sunglasses to a young audience member, as he usually would do. His parents are sitting in the audience. There's a whole bunch of other Wrestling Hall of Famers in the audience. So they're really trying to present as clearly as possible this clash between tradition and
I mean,
what's
it was
happening.
WrestleMania. We can't forget to mention that. You know, it was the biggest show of the year, and it was the first time in a long, long time that the WWF was not the biggest wrestling company in the world. WCW had overtaken them.
So basically, leading up to this match, they were not doing well. Like, they were
Right.
things nobody cared, nobody was watching, everything was boring, everything was the corpse of the 80s.
They had put a lot into Shawn Michaels, actually, as being kind of the next big star, and then he sort of self-destructed.
Yeah, that's a whole other story. But he wasn't going to be the guy to turn business around.
Yeah.
Now was the time to do something different, and this was something different.
So the match stylistically, in terms of how they're wrestling, is already a departure in that they spend the first half of the match is completely outside of the ring. They brawl into the crowd. This was not something common at that time. In the ensuing years, it would be way overdone, and every single match would spill out over into the crowd.
It does. The way that people react is they seem very surprised that this is happening. And like the way, I gotta say, there's a point where they're out in the crowd and you see people like reverently like reaching out to touch them in this with this sort of religious awe in a way that I'm like, first off, those guys are definitely disgusting right now to
Yes.
touch. There's definitely
They're covered in
your
sweat and
hand is
oil.
coming away with slime on it. Also, they probably don't want you to do that. That's very distracting, I would imagine, when
Yes,
you're already trying to fake fight a guy out in an audience and not actually hurt anybody around you.
Yeah, this was before that was done a lot, you know. So people didn't, you know, they were crazy. This guy's right in front of me now. I've only seen him on TV or behind the barricade. Another thing that makes that odd that we haven't mentioned is that this was a submission match. You had to win by putting a hold on the other guy or making the other guy quit.
They had to say the words "I quit,"
Yeah,
which was
in the
actually
ring, I might add.
was a callback to a match at the WrestleMania 2 years previous.
Yeah.
WrestleMania 11, where Bret Hart wrestled Bob Backlund, who was a guy from the pre-Hogan era.
Yeah, he was champion for about 5 to 6 years in the late 70s to the early 80s. He is the white meat USA babyface you could ever see. He was so Irish, he glowed. He was so American, like, oh my God.
And the story of that match was that Backlund
Was he
had
Irish?
snapped because guys like Bret Hart were departing too much from his own values.
Yeah.
So now Bret is cast, you know, in that position of the curmudgeon against the rebel or whatever, in the opposite position than he was in 2 years previous.
How much do wrestling fans think about all this? Like, are you guys, like, how nerdy are you guys in comparison to wrestling fans?
Pretty nerdy.
We're super nerdy in reflecting on these features, but I think everyone feels them. I think subconsciously or implicitly they matter to wrestling fans. Yeah. They just haven't really thought about them with the sort of conceptual apparatus to kind of pull these things out. I'm pretty sure that most people listening to these kinds of analyses who are big wrestling fans, I'd like to think that they're going to resonate. What we're saying is going to resonate with them.
Trying to put together a wrestling event, and again, same as other media, the center is not in what you're putting out. The center is in how the people consuming it are going to react. What made the double turn successful, it isn't that Austin stopped cheating and Bret started cheating. That's not how that works. What made the double turn successful is that they got the audience to feel something different over the course of the match. So the audience decided themselves by the end of the match, they like Austin now and not Bret. And you can't force that. You have to let it happen. You have to create a scenario where people will decide that on their own.
The writer or whatever, the booker, like whoever is part of the creative process of deciding who wins a match and how that match is going to unfold, how often do they aim and miss? How often are they like, okay, at the end of this match, we think the audience is going to feel this way, and to anybody watching the match, it's clear both what their intention was and that they missed it in comparison to this match.
It varies heavily from time to time. They miss a lot today. They started hitting a lot right after this match.
The last few years, they've been missing more than they ever had before. It's getting harder and harder, I think, for them to anticipate and respond to the audience.
Do you think that is because the audience is savvier than it used to be?
No,
is that
it's the
they've
children
been around?
that are wrong.
It is always the children
Yeah.
that are wrong. When will
No,
they
yes,
learn?
the audience is savvy. The audience is
the audience
different.
has so much more information at their disposal with
Sure.
the internet to begin with, right? You can't really lie to them. It's so easy to just Google something and be like, oh, wait, this guy isn't really, from Haiti.
Right, Kofi Kingston isn't really Jamaican. He's from Ghana.
Right.
The wrestling world at large learned that Kofi Kingston wasn't really from Jamaica and he was from Ghana when one of his relatives did an interview in Ghana saying, why isn't he just saying he's from Ghana? And the real reason why was that most people in America don't know where Ghana is, but they have an idea of what Jamaica is. And then Kofi dropped the fake Jamaican accent, was like, yeah, I'm Kofi Kingston. I was born from Ghana, and now he's the WWE champion. It's much more successful for him.
And the other thing, while I do think that our way of thinking about wrestling is probably more sophisticated than the average wrestling fan has gotten way more sophisticated in this same way, where they're thinking about face turns and heel turns and who's getting pushed and all this other stuff, all this like kind of insider stuff that just wasn't parlance of most audiences' conceptual architecture before.
Sometimes I wonder how much becoming savvy is a good thing. For right here, I'm a writer. I have had no success that is, meaningful, but I've been doing it for a long time and I like doing it. And so when I watch TV shows I love, of course I dissect them in my brain and I'm like, oh, blah, 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 and I could write, 20,000 words on my feelings about how Game of Thrones ended and that kind of stuff. But I tend not to put it out there because there's so many takes. Everybody's got piping hot takes about everything. Everybody's deconstructing it to an insane level. Before I came down, I watched Lindsay Ellis's 2.5 hour thing on the end of Game of Thrones and all this stuff, which was great. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that, but there is a point at which, and I'm picking Game of Thrones as an easy example because it was something that was a large cultural phenomenon where everybody got very specific about the ways in which they feel that the writers were not executing their thing properly. And a lot of people were right. Like, a lot of those takes were absolutely fucking great and on point. But then as I was watching all of that happen, I start wondering, how is anything going to be good in the future? Like, if we all know things that 30 years ago you had to be like a professional screenwriter to even think about any of this shit, if everybody knows about structure and tropes and all of this, there's a point where that's really good because it forces the people making the creative product to get better and better and better. There seems like a point at which it just becomes impossible, where everybody's expectations are set impossibly high and people can't possibly fucking produce that.
Yeah, it might be. It might cause the death of a lot of forms of media for two reasons. For the reason that you've already said on the part of the audience, but I think there's another danger on the part of the producers that they get so good at figuring out the right formula that the stuff, there aren't any surprises anymore. Sometimes it's good to have some misses just because it just keeps it interesting, right?
Once the formula is set, it only works for so long before it gets boring and then something breaks through, You're right, and that is a thing that's happened across all media, that Everyone now has enough information to make judgments, but not enough information to have the context of why creators do, certain things. George Carlin said once, I don't concern myself when I see a movie of whether or not it's any good. The fact that hundreds of people got together for months and put together this incredible piece of media and worked hard on it is enough for me, because he'd been in show business long enough to know how hard it is to make something that sucks, let alone something that's good. And sometimes the difference between that has nothing to do with most of the people involved in it.
That's always the question, right?
Yeah.
I tried to shoot shoot a pilot a few years ago that when I might as well have just lit $3,000 on fire, basically. Like, it was a great learning experience, and everybody who was part of it was fucking awesome, and we all worked really hard, and it was pretty much entirely my fault that it didn't work out. So if any of those people are listening to this, don't worry, I'm not blaming you. But that experience simultaneously gave me, like, I was like, oh, now I understand how movies cost $200 million. I could have spent $200 million on this fucking, like, 5-minute thing that we tried to shoot, and it didn't work. And at the same time, it makes you wonder, like, how, when something that is truly bad gets put out there, and you know how many people were involved and all this, it also makes you go, like, nobody stopped and said, like, what are we doing? Guy, can we take a look at the script? Can we do something here? Like, not one single person, and I guess
the times though, lots of people say that, but not the 2 or 3 people in charge who are able to do something. Like, have you ever had a job where everybody that works at the job knows exactly what the problem is except the boss?
Oh, you mean all jobs I've ever had?
Yes.
Pretty much. I think 2 exceptions out of 20.
So, Steve Austin and Bret Hart. Sorry.
Yeah,
look, this is a wide-ranging podcast.
We were gonna just talk about the match for like the next.
This is a podcast that covers the human experience through the lens of learning about wrestling.
Yes, I know.
So one major detail we haven't said is that we have a special guest referee involved, which is MMA fighter Ken Shamrock, who's about to start wrestling for the WWF at the time.
The UFC had just started to become a popular thing.
Yeah, it was being banned and unbanned in states left and right.
And bringing Shamrock, like a real fighter in, lent this air of realism and real violence and real kind of combat to the match and to the subsequent wrestling period. They
didn't overdo his appearance. He was there. He kept order. He got involved physically once after the match.
Right. So we have this literal transgressing of boundaries, them fighting in the crowd. Bret Hart even gets thrown onto the legends that are sitting in the front row.
Right.
Hart wrestles in this really kind of calculatedly violent and dirty way. Which is interesting because you would expect that from Austin, but the fact that Bret is sort of stooping to his level is, I think, what makes Bret a heel in the end, is the fact that he's abandoning his own principles, his own values. And he does it in really interesting ways. Like, for instance, in this match, he innovates the figure 4 around the ring post. So he takes a classic pro wrestling move that Ric Flair used to do that was involved in some of the biggest NWA title changes of the last 30 years and whatever, and he turns it into this, newfangled, extreme, weaponized hold around the ring post. Bret really pulls this kind of stuff out in this match, and in the end, ends up bloodying Austin, and we get this iconic scene of Austin in the sharpshooter, Bret Hart's submission hold, bleeding out of the head, wearing the proverbial crimson mask. I'm not sure what proverb that is that talks about
Austin
the
316.
Yeah, it's obviously.
It must be Austin 317.
Oh, okay, right.
Because we know what Austin 316 is.
And so in the end, Austin never submits. He passes out from the blood loss. And that's extremely important too, because, so if Austin had won the match, maybe some of the crowd would have been happy, but it wouldn't have made Hart a villain, and it wouldn't have made Austin that much of a hero.
It would have proven that Bret was indeed better than Austin and could show Austin that.
If Austin had tapped out.
Tapped out.
But I'm saying even if Austin had won, it wouldn't have accomplished what they wanted to. He had to have been sort of frustrated by the loss in a certain way, that you needed to get the crowd to have sympathy for him. And so he had to lose, but he couldn't tap out. That would have belied the kind of resilience and tough sort of virtues that he was supposed to embody. So it had to be this sort of delicate balance where he loses, but he doesn't quit. And then in the end, Bret Hart attacks him after the match, even further departing from the sort of, respect and integrity and all the other stuff that Bret was supposed to represent. And that's when we get the full turn and Austin comes out a complete hero.
Shamrock
Bret a
pulls
villain.
Bret physically off of Austin, instantly making him a star in the professional wrestling world. He puts his hands up and the crowd is ready to see him fight Bret. And then Bret walks away.
And then Austin Stone Cold Stunners the poor innocent referee to the delight of the audience,
Right.
showing that while he is
not Shamrock, the other regular little referee that comes in.
right, showing that while he is the hero now, he is clearly an anti-hero. He's not embodying the same values that Bret Hart did before. And this to me is what's so interesting about pro wrestling, and specifically this match, is how you have what is happening in the ring, and the story that's unfolding is determined by the shifting values of the people in the audience.
I felt like a really powerful moment when they go to that shot of Bret's whole family sitting there, and his father, who you've mentioned and we've talked about in some other episodes, but that look of disappointment on his face, which maybe it's all theater, maybe there's some percentage of actual disappointment there, I don't know, but like that had to be a real moment, both in terms of the story and maybe also for Bret in real life.
Oh,
who knows?
Who knows with Stu Hart? I don't know, man.
Because maybe it was Stu Hart sitting there being like, I can't believe how wrestling's changed.
But yeah, just to interject a little philosophy in here.
That is the whole reason you're here.
The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche described culture and society and perhaps the universe as a whole as a kind of contest of competing values, of competing wills and valuations. And I think professional wrestling is just a really great representation of that universal contest.
Kind of like where each individual wrestler sort of represents a particular strain of thought or belief system or ideology or something like that, and they are fighting each other. Because I would imagine it is something akin to, they say like in musical theater, you talk, and then when you can no longer express yourself with words, that's when you start to sing, and then you sing, and once you can no longer express yourself through singing, then that's when you start to dance. And I would imagine that in wrestling it is something like the storylines are two people have issues with each other, and there is perhaps some attempt to express that verbally, but really what it comes down to is once their beef can no longer be contained by words or by what is normally accepted by society, they must take it to the ring.
Yeah, and if you think about, the sort of classic face-heel dichotomy, the way it was expressed in Roland Barthes' seminal essay, The World of Wrestling.
Former NWA champion.
Yeah, Roland, the semiologist and former NWA.
Somewhere between Harley Race reigns, I think.
It's like the one classic academic treatment of wrestling was done by Roland Barthes in the 30s. And it really maps on actually very well to this thing that Nietzsche describes in his essay Homer's Contest, his very early essay, where in ancient Greece there were two different kinds of jealousy, or eris, E-R-I-S. The good eris, the healthy eris, the baby face of the contest, is the person who is jealous of their opponent being better than them because they want to be that good or even better. Right? So they compete they want their opponent to be as good as possible so that they can rise to be even greater in defeating them. The bad eris, the bad jealousy, is when you just want your opponent to be injured or disqualified or something so that you win by default. And I think that maps on pretty well to sort of the classic babyface heel dichotomy. Though, of course, that changes over time. And as Nietzsche talked about, the contest itself changes as the elements of the contest change, particularly the one that's on top.
So is it sort of like, if you're looking at the basic dichotomy of wrestling, where it is, an athletic competition on one extreme and a piece of theater on another extreme, you could also vaguely classify faces and heels into those who ostensibly care about this being an athletic competition those who ostensibly care about fighting each other according to the rules, or at least according to some sort of a moral code, and that's what's important, versus those who are interested in self-gratification, those who are interested in winning at all costs, and are uninterested in even the appearance of a contest.
That's one way in which, and I guess
those
maybe
being
classically,
those being two extremes.
Those can be the extremes, but this can all change. Eddie Guerrero was famous for lying, cheating, and stealing to the delight of the crowd.
Sure.
That's the main thing, I think, for me in defining faces and heels. Faces do things because the crowd likes it. Heels do things because the crowd hates it. Most generally. Even that, though, I think might be overly reductive.
It's a spectrum, and it depends on the story that's being told and the audience that's there. A really good promoter will educate their audience first and then exploit what they've taught the audience is good and bad. One story that I like to repeat that I heard Jim Cornette say was that when they were doing tar and feather matches in Tennessee, it was comedy. The heels would lose, or the faces would lose, or whatever, and they'd cover them in like honey or something and feathers, and it would be a big humiliating thing. And then, when they went down to Louisiana territory and tried it, the crowds took it very, very seriously because they actually had tarring and feathering, which is actually a way to slowly and very painfully kill somebody with boiling tar.
And that had happened like in recent memory.
In recent memory.
It was not.
So it was the difference between a Three Stooges routine and the way we have seen people die.
And the fact that if the Three Stooges were real, like that's some really dark stuff to do to each other.
Well, the Three Stooges would do awful things physically to each other, and they'd be fine because that's slapstick.
Or because of Stockholm Syndrome.
What, the Three Stooges?
Yeah, they just, Mo was their abuser. And
Mo was their abuser. Well, they'd all abuse each other,
But it was there was a power dynamic that, in
there
retrospect, is deeply uncomfortable. In speaking of power dynamics that are incredibly uncomfortable, we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back and discuss this week's bad match.
Can I say something before we do this? Yes. So this is the initial episode. We decided we wanted to show Evan the classics. We also, I've been reading about wrestling on the internet for a very long time, since I was very young. And one of the things about wrestling fandom, and it's not unlike other fandom, we also like to talk a lot about the stuff that wasn't so good. And so we decided to show Evan.
The WrestleCrap website was very popular.
The influence of WrestleCrap cannot be understated. If you don't know what they are, look them up. They've been around since the 90s. But the match that we brought up was from Survivor Series 1994.
There should not have been survivors.
No, but there were a few. And the match itself was Doink the Clown, and Dink the Clown, and Wink the Clown, and Pink the Clown, the three of them being little people in clown outfits, versus Jerry the King Lawler. Google Jerry the King Lawler allegations one of these days.
Oh, God.
So it's Jerry the King Lawler.
That doesn't surprise me. I mean, I know him from documentaries about Andy Kaufman. That's my familiarity.
He's a brilliant performer, despite what you have seen. Jerry the King Lawler and his three little person kings, Cheesy, Sleazy, and Queasy. So, Evan, what were your impressions of this Survivor Series elimination-style tag team contest?
I would say my two big takeaways. I was shocked at the fan reaction, specifically in that there wasn't much of one. I'm surprised they did not rise up and slay everybody involved. I'm surprised that they did not storm out of the ring, or not the ring. I'm surprised they did not storm out of the arena and demand their money back. I am amazed that the McMahon family has been able to continue their lives unharassed after putting such shit into the world. I firmly think that America really needs to pay reparations to little people, and that we need to seize the McMahon fortune to serve as the basis for that. I'm also sure that wrestling has wronged a lot of other groups of people, but this is who I'm focused on.
And in the case of these little people, or as it was and continues to be called, midget wrestling,
they still call it that?
I've never met a little person who wrestles that doesn't like the term midget wrestling. The line in the business is, nobody's ever bought a ticket to see little people wrestling, but I've made a lot of money off
I
of
know.
midget
and,
wrestling.
and
that's
little,
the thing
and the
is-
term little people does feel, I use it because that's what Peter Dinklage says, but it feels weird.
It sounds
every time
kinda
I say it, it
patronizing,
absolutely
you know?
does, but that's what people
Whatever.
want.
People can be called whatever they want.
And there
They'll do
are
it.
few greater paydays, at least in the entertainment world, for little people than
yeah.
professional
Man,
wrestling.
that's a more searing
true.
indictment of our culture, but I do see
Yes.
see your point.
I mean, if you listen to Dinklage talk about the kind of acting roles that were available to him, or that he turned down.
Oh my God, yeah.
In order to forge the career that he
He
has.
could have been Pink.
Like what?
course
Like
I'm right.
seriously? Like what the fuck is this? Like why did this get made? Why did people take the time to practice this? There was clearly a lot of rehearsal and choreography for it, because every time they did a bit, they did it 5 more times.
The structure of the match was the Doink and his little clowns would do something to minorly injure or humiliate Jerry Lawler, and it would involve all of them. And then Jerry Lawler would try the same thing with his little kings, and they would fail. And they did this sequence at least 5 times. The whole match, like, I thought the match would be bad, but I hadn't seen it in a while, and it is much worse than I thought it was.
Like my conception of bad wrestling and what I didn't like, and all of the things that I hated back in the 90s or whatever, all of that is so much better than this.
Which is part of why it was so popular in the late 90s, because it was just different from a lot of what had come before, which was so much worse. The crazy thing about it is, as you've already pointed out, not only did the crowd not riot, but the crowd seemed to actually enjoy the match.
Yeah. So what is that? Like,
It was the people they were drawing at the time, which they were getting small crowds, and they were getting crowds with, like, little kids, and it was, you know...
I mean,
they were trying to find the next thing, and they hadn't found it yet.
like I can imagine a child really enjoying this. I can imagine if it was 5 minutes long, I could see an adult being like, "Oh, this is sort of enjoyable." I mean, this felt like it went on. I know it didn't actually go on for an hour, but it felt
probably
like it went
on
on for a really long time. Like,
it was 15 or 16 minutes. You're right. The biggest actual flaw in this is that it was way too long. They could have done the one gag and moved on.
there was a point where we checked the time while we were watching it, and I was just like, I was so mortified at how much time was left.
Making it even worse was the fact that the whole structure of the match was completely misconceived, because it was a mixed tag match, as they call it, so that the larger wrestlers could only wrestle the larger wrestlers and the smaller wrestlers could only wrestle each other. So, and yet it was an elimination match. So once Doink, the larger wrestler on his team, was eliminated, there was actually literally no way that the other clowns could win the match, because none of them were legally allowed to be in the ring with Jerry Lawler in order to eliminate him. And yet that happened. Doink was eliminated very early in the match. So the vast majority of it just literally made no sense whatsoever.
You said something there that we actually had not said yet. For anybody who has not watched the match, for anybody listening to this who's kind of more on my side of the equation, Doink is the clown wrestler. So just stop and take that in for a moment. He's a clown wrestler. I can only presume his moves are clown-themed.
Yeah, and it wasn't even the original Doink, actually. The original Doink was a very accomplished
Was his family like
professional wrestler.
put under a curse by a witch, and then his son had to also be a clown wrestler, and then that's going to go on for another 5 generations?
No, he had drug problems, and they fired him. But let me tell you the real difference is that Doink, as you saw him, was a clown. The original Doink was an evil clown, which is so much more interesting from a storytelling perspective, really.
Look, nobody has come here today to disparage evil clowns. What was the difference in their behavior?
Well, Doink, the regular clown, would come out and smile and squirt his flour with the water onto the bad guys and shake the kids' hands and run around the ring and climb to the top rope and sit on his opponent.
That was the whoopee cushion.
They would pipe in a fart noise on television. Doink, the evil clown, would come out with his arm in a sling, antagonize the baby faces a bit. Give one of them some flowers. The baby face would begrudgingly take it, go and give it to a child. And then Doink would take his arm out of the sling, which was really a pipe, and beat the crap out of the baby face when his back was turned, and then laugh at him.
Okay, I mean, that's more...
That's so much better.
Yeah,
it was
I
only
would take
about
that.
a year. It was the most entertaining thing on the first year of Monday Night Raw. I'll say that. And the crowd at the Manhattan Center, where they taped almost every episode that year, loved it.
Because I would say if the best part of your character is the fart noise that they have to add in post-production. Like, that's not... I'm not anti a fart noise
Oh, no, of course not.
being part of a character, but...
Let me just say, though, that the best wrestler in that match, the best performer, besides Jerry Lawler, perhaps, if, Jerry Lawler at least sold things as well as you possibly could with his facial expressions and that sort of thing. But the guy who played Dink was actually really excellent. And the few actually athletic, somewhat impressive spots in the match come from him.
Yeah, it was a veteran of the little person scene, and he was the guy that they called when they needed one guy on the roster like that.
Mm-hmm.
If you watch closely, you can see him kind of calling the shots and getting everybody to follow him because nobody else in the match seems to know what the hell is going on, despite the overly simple format.
This was a real roller coaster between the two matches. Hart Austin... I had problems with it, but there were moments where I was like, all right, I definitely can see the things that these guys do that are cool, but what little goodwill was built up there, I have to say, was erased along with part of my frontal lobe by watching this Doink Lawler match.
Another point of contrast between the two matches, and there are seemingly infinite ones, is the fact that Hart Austin was one of the feature matches on WrestleMania 13. It wasn't actually the official main event, but was way more highly anticipated than the main event was.
There were some big problems with the main event, last-minute substitutions and so on, but Hart Austin was a match that had been building and building and building for months.
Whereas Doink and the Clowns versus Lawler and the Kings was the undercard. Kind of a throwaway thing for the really little kids in between some of the more important matches.
Time for you to go take a piss. If you're
Some people,
there seeing it,
actually. If you're putting on a 3-hour event at an arena, you got to put something like that in sometimes. There wasn't an intermission or anything on the pay-per-view broadcast.
I was very upset that there was no intermission during Avengers Endgame. I'm just like, how have we not learned this lesson? This is a lesson that Bollywood's known for decades.
You could fit another showing into the theater.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's it.
Yeah.
I just think this year's WrestleMania was 7.5 hours
Jesus.
with no intermission.
Jesus, so you
the
go.
pre-show was slow.
I mean, I guess I've seen I don't know. I guess I've gone to music festivals of some kind where you're sort of in one spot for a while. But that's a long time, man.
I went to Ozfest once and got there at 9 in the morning because I wanted to see Lacuna Coil and they were playing at 9:30, and then I was there until 11. It was too much. It was too much.
But I must say, this wasn't my favorite WrestleMania of all time, but they did do a miraculous job at not completely burning out the crowd early in the show. And that's, a lot of, and I think as we go on with this podcast, we'll probably start watching larger chunks of wrestling, like full shows and not just individual matches. And the thought that has to go behind the pacing of the entire show, not just the ebb and flow of a particular match, talking about, the slower and more boring parts as opposed to the more exciting climactic parts. Think about that, not just within a individual match, but now across a 3-4+ hour show.
I honestly feel like I'm back in school taking an opera class again, because that's my frame of reference for something that's 7 hours long and made up with and as much as I love classical music, I've never been a big opera guy.
We're not going to make you watch this most recent WrestleMania.
Well, and then you're putting on a show and you want people to come back the next week or the next month or whatever it is. So you also can't burn them out completely in that one night. Now, WrestleMania is what the whole year has been building to. So there's sort of an expectation that they're going to, throw it all out there. And then the next night we're starting again slowly.
And Raw and SmackDown don't stop for the summer, right?
Never,
like there's never
never.
repeats. There's never
There's
like it's
50 to 51 original episodes a year. Sometimes during Christmas they'll have a week where it's like the best of SmackDown that year, but sometimes they don't.
They haven't done that in a long time.
haven't
I
done
don't
that
think.
in a
so we're
while,
talking like 104 episodes of TV and like 20 odd pay-per-views or 10 to 20
There's
pay-per-views.
about 15, 16 pay-per-views now, plus the NXT show, plus the 205 Live show, plus
Yeah,
the
they have a
UK
bunch of
show.
minor. They have some.
The
minor
WWE has a full roster of over 200 people, and they have many brands. They have at least 5 full-time brands.
I would add up all those hours to think about how much it is per year, but it would make me way too sad about how I've spent my life.
Oh, don't do that's like doing the math on how much you've spent on weed in your life. Like just it's just going to be sad. It's just going to give your enemies ammo. All right. Well, on that note,
Did we talk about all the things?
I think we talked about all of the things.
Excellent. Remember, kids, professional wrestling is like opera.
Professional wrestling is like opera, and if you are somebody who was personally responsible for the Doink Lawler match, I am going to need you to email us an apology and Venmo me $5.
Looking at you, Bruce Pritchard.
Yeah, Bruce Pritchard.
It's great that Evan doesn't know who Bruce Pritchard is. Bury Bruce Pritchard for us, Evan.
I will. I'm coming for him. I'm going to do some Googling, and then I'm going to fucking bury this guy in episode 2.
If we can start a Twitter war with Bruce Pritchard, we will get so many listeners.
All right. Okay. So we're going to plan that for we have our planning session once we're done recording. So
Excellent.
we're going to talk about that.
Russo, you're next.
I don't want to be involved with Russo.
Yeah, that's probably for the best.
Alrighty. So this has been first episode of Contesting Wrestling. We are going to get all of our social media stuff together very soon. So next episode, we will tell you where to follow all of us as a collective. If you would like to follow us individually, you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Evan Burke, etc. That's Evan Burke, ETC. You can also check out my writing at evanburke.biz.
You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Diamondfire. That's at Dr. Diamondfire. You can find me on Facebook under Doc Rod Diamondfire, but I don't really use it. So find me on Twitter. I'm available for bookings, both wrestling, commentating, ring announcing.
You can find me at Scribe Ben. That's ScribeBen on Instagram and Twitter. If you have academia.edu, you can find some of my scholarly articles on my academia.edu page. Stay away from my Facebook. I mean it.
Stay away from me personally. If you see me on the street, don't just keep walking.
If you see me on the street, come up to me, give me $1. I'll talk to you for a while about wrestling.
You know what?
And then give me another $1.
Your thing is better. I rescind my thing and go with your thing. I
have been trained by a few carnies in my day. You're not, I'm not a little kid anymore. Please give me money.
And on that note,
Yes.
Please make sure you go to patreon.com/contestingwrestling. You can subscribe to us. We have a $1 tier if you want to just be cool. I don't know who's going to go with that, but it's there. And then we have a $5 tier that will grant you access to all of our bonus content, which includes watch-alongs, occasional bonus episodes, and the more money we have, the more you utterly smash that like and subscribe button, the more chances we will have to produce more bonus content for you, leading to a vicious cycle. But like the good kind of a vicious cycle.
Some people don't want to be cool. Don't be one of them people.
They don't. I mean, if you are one of those people, you can still just give us $1 a month and then not have access to premium content.
You'd still be pretty cool.
Yeah. You'd be better than everyone else.
Better than everyone else.
And that's what's important. Thank you. This has been Contesting Wrestling.